Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Patrick Nelson from Speakers Associates, and I'm your host today. Great to see you all. If you're watching live, hello, and if you're catching this on the recording afterwards, welcome. So we're here today to talk about hybrid meetings, something that's become a daily reality for so many of us over the last few years. But the thing about hybrid meetings, they don't work as well as they should. I think we all know that hybrid works here to stay, but all too often those hybrid meetings favor the loudest voices, leave some people disengaged, and most importantly, they quietly undermine inclusion and collaboration. So today's session is about moving beyond that frustration. And that's why I'm so pleased to be joined by my colleague, Clare Kenny. Now, Clare is a global leadership and well-being specialist, and Clare works with leaders and organizations to improve communication, inclusion, and participation, both in hybrid and digital working environments and in live environments as well. What I've learned to appreciate about Clare's work is that it is extremely practical. It's always grounded in real behavior, and it's focused on things that leaders and managers can actually do rather than theoretical concepts. So in this session today, Claire is going to explore how we can all make hybrid meetings more inclusive and more engaging. And this is very much a hands-on, immediately applicable session as well. So a couple of quick notes. It's being recorded and streamed live. So it's being streamed live on LinkedIn, but if you can't stay for the full session, it is being recorded as well. And my colleague Esther will make the recording available afterwards. If throughout Claire's talk, if you have any comments or questions, please use the comments on LinkedIn to share them as we go. Claire will answer any questions towards the end after the talk, but she may also ask for your participation during the talk. So be ready to respond with a quick comment or a thumbs up or whatever it is that Claire requires. So Claire, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you for having me, and welcome to everyone on this session around making hybrid meetings more inclusive and engaging. And one of the things that I wanted to really kind of make clear is that can feel quite kind of tactical in terms of like, what do I do specifically in meetings, which is helpful, but it's actually about how do you lead in a hybrid world, because it's all about how do we make sure that we're boosting inclusion, we're giving people a voice, we're making sure that people feel safe, that there's psychological safety, and meetings are one of the ways in which we bring our teams together. So it's thinking about how do we make sure that we're creating those moments that really show people that they are psychologically safe, that we want to hear what they've got to say, and thinking about how are we doing that, not just from an administrative task when it comes to hybrid meetings, but how are we making sure that the way that we're leading in a hybrid environment is actually effective and is building those things that we want people to be able to see. So I'm just going to share my slides here so you can follow along with these as well. So first of all, just to kind of give you a bit of a background in terms of when it comes to hybrid working, there are a lot of inclusion problems that happen in organizations in general, and we can talk a little bit about what that looks like. But hybrid working, it hasn't created those inclusion problems, it's exposed them. It has made it more clear that certain types of thinking, certain types of communication are the types that are noted, responded to, recognized, and that there are lots of people that just don't get the opportunity to feedback when it comes to the way that they think, their ideas, because of the way that hybrid working is set up in terms of digital meetings, in terms of digital communication. And that has become much, much clearer in a hybrid world versus a more in-office situation. It was still there in an in-office situation, but hybrid has really expanded that and made it a stronger, more obvious issue. So it's how do we address that? What are some of the things that are actually important when it comes to that imbalance, when it comes to inclusion? Leaders are often seeing those gaps. Perhaps you didn't even notice them before. So this is really an opportunity. We're quite new into hybrid working in terms of post-pandemic. It's quite new for everyone to be working in a hybrid way. So this is a real opportunity. How do we rewrite the ways in which we're working? How do we rewrite some of our processes, some of the ways in which we communicate, so that we can start to build that inclusion? Because inclusion It's not just a nice thing to have. It's not just a thing that helps people feel good and engaged, while it does. When we don't include all of the minds in the room, we are lacking all of those ideas, all of those skills, all of that incredible potential skill when we don't include everybody in the room. So it's thinking about, what can we do to have the edge? What can we do to make sure that we are ahead of our competitors? And that is by leveraging the power and expertise you have in the room. And that can be quite simple in terms of a few ways in which you can tweak your processes and ways of working that's going to help you be able to build that inclusion, is going to help people to feel able to contribute. And therefore, you're going to start seeing that real benefit and that real power that comes from that. So, what are some of the issues that you often notice when it comes to hybrid meetings, or really, I think any type of meeting? I think we have got quite a traditional way when it comes to approaching our meetings, and I don't think that they've changed a huge deal over time. And the issue there is that one type of voice is often going to get rewarded. One type of voice is seen, and it is those people who are extroverted. It is people who are processing quickly, who are active thinkers, perhaps want to speak their ideas out loud, feel really confident asking questions or answering questions in a group. But actually, there are so many different types of brains, skills, expertise that just don't work in that kind of way. And it doesn't mean that they're any less, it just means that they're processing in a different way. So we often find those same view voices are dominating. We are hearing from the same people time and time again. People who are remote are much less likely to participate. It's really hard to get a sense of the room if there are people in a room and then there are people on remote. When do you speak? When are you being invited to speak? Often it's like, does anyone have anything to contribute? And there's this real sort of awkward silence where you don't know whether someone's getting to come off mute to share their ideas, or if no one wants to say anything. So often remote people just find it a lot more comfortable to just not speak at all. Your chat perhaps becomes that side room. It's where people put stuff that they probably wouldn't feel too safe saying out loud. So perhaps some of that dissent, some of those comments, perhaps things where people are feeling a bit cynical, that might come out a bit more in the chat rather than in the main discussion. And often silence is misinterpreted. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But often we will assume that silence either means everyone's in agreement, or it's that people are disengaged, or people are too nervous to speak up. But actually, there are so many different reasons why there might be silence. People might be reflecting, people might be not feeling psychologically safe to speak up, they might need time to process what's going through. And often, as leaders or people who are running and leading meetings, we often rush to fill that silence because it feels awkward, whereas actually that silence can be getting us to a really important place, and we're sort of rushing through the discomfort rather than allowing that silence to breathe and give people a chance to reflect and feedback. So have a think, reflect yourself. Are these things that you're seeing in the meetings that you are either running or attending? Are there things kind of in a mental checklist? These are patterns that show up everywhere. So it's not like a failure if this stuff is showing up. Even the highest performing teams will have examples of this stuff coming up, but it's thinking about, are those patterns that are coming up again and again that you might recognize? Another thing when it comes to silence is that we often treat it as a personality issue. We think, oh, well, that person is too nervous to speak, or they never get engaged, they never engage, or, they're just someone who is really cynical and doesn't want to connect. But that is not the case at all. Not everybody wants to speak out loud in a meeting, and they never will do. And that doesn't mean that they are less than. It means that they probably process information in a completely different way. They need to feed back in a completely different way. So how do we create systems where we are allowing everybody in the room to give their feedback? And whether that is through tech, whether that is through how we collect feedback, whether we give people time to reflect, it's making sure that we are being inclusive to all the types of brain, whether people are neurodivergent, whether people are introvert, extrovert, whether people process things in different ways. There are so many different reasons why someone might not just be able to give you an answer or give you feedback or give you reflections in the moment. And so therefore we have to design the systems and the way in which we are communicating with people so that we do not miss out. Because at the moment we're probably only giving a benefit and giving an opportunity for sort of 20% of the people in the room versus thinking about what are the other 80%? What is it that they need? How can we make sure that we are leveraging their brains, their insights, and making sure that we're getting that feedback from them as well? So what can we do to make sure that we are not just putting down silence to a personality issue, but it's thinking about what are the systems around it and how can we make sure that we're being really conscientious about the way that we're building that so that it is inclusive and that we are capturing as much data as possible. So psychological safety, I've mentioned that earlier, and it's a really important, it's the foundation, really, I think, when it comes to how do we lead in a hybrid world? How do we lead a tool? I had a question the other day. I was delivering a keynote and someone said to me, oh, there's so many things we could do. If we only did one thing, what would you do? What would you do to help boost performance? And I said, I would look at your psychological safety. I would start to think about how psychological safe do people feel within your organization? And for those of you who aren't clear or don't really understand what psychological safety is, I'll give you a quick history lesson in terms of where that phrase has come from and what it means and why it's so important. So Amy Edmondson, she is a Harvard professor. And it was 1999 and she'd written a paper on psychological safety. And interestingly enough, she discovered psychological safety by accident, which I feel is very apt because she was looking at data. She was looking at teams and performance in teams, and she had a hypothesis. And her hypothesis was that high-performing teams that were more engaged, were more connected, felt more cohesive, they were going to be less likely to make mistakes. And so she looked at a whole lot of data from different teams, and she said to herself, okay, so that's my hypothesis. And then when she started to delve into the data, she could see that actually the teams that were more cohesive, felt more connected, more engaged, were actually making more mistakes. And she was like, well, this is the absolute opposite of what I expected it to be. And so she looked a bit deeper and she realized that what was actually happening here is that those teams that felt safer, felt more cohesive, felt more engaged, they were much more likely to report mistakes. So they were much more likely to raise them earlier. They were much more likely to reach out for support. They didn't feel like it was going to be held against them if they spoke about their mistakes. Whereas the teams that didn't feel safe, the teams that didn't feel connected, they were much more likely to hide their mistakes, push them under the rug, perhaps avoid talking about them. Perhaps they only came to light when everything, like a complete catastrophe, happened and they couldn't hide them anymore. So it really showed the difference. Mistakes are human. We all make mistakes. And actually, to innovate, to grow, to learn, we need to make mistakes quickly, learn from them and grow. And so these teams that were feeling that level of safety and that cohesiveness were much more likely to report those mistakes, share them, learn from them and move forward. And that was the real fundamental foundations when it came to psychological safety. So Amy Edmondson, in terms of how she described it, was it's a climate in which people are comfortable expressing and being themselves. So they're able to bring their authentic self. They're able to bring all of that difference of opinion, that difference of background, experience, and they also feel comfortable sharing concerns and mistakes. So not only say, I think I've messed up here, can you help? But also say, I think you've messed up here. What can we do about it? Or I actually think this system isn't working and we could be able to do this better. It's about being able to challenge that status quo, to be able to spot problems, spot issues, and be able to feel safe enough to talk about them, to bring them up, no matter who you're speaking to, no matter the kind of level or the hierarchy, and then be able to learn and move forward. And Amy Edmondson, she wrote this paper in about 1999. It didn't really go very far. Not a huge amount of people read it. And then it was not until about 2012 where Google ran a project called Project Aristotle. And Project Aristotle was a study. They were trying to find out what drove high performance in teams. And they looked at 180 different teams across the world. And it was 2 years they spent studying all of these teams. And they were trying to look at lots of different factors. Okay, what is it that drives team? Is it charismatic leadership? Is it shared vision, shared goals? Like all of these different factors they were looking at. And they weren't finding anything that was really kind of clearly making that kind of causation. And then they came across Amy Edmondson's paper and they were like, well, let's have a look at psychological safety. And they found that it was by far the number one driver of team performance. So it's not just a nice to have, it makes that huge difference because you're able to innovate, you're able to sort of stay ahead of your competitors, you are leveraging all of the skill within your teams, you are feeling comfortable to learn, to grow, to make errors quickly and move forward. You're much more likely to be collaborative, cohesive together when you build that psychological safety. So it's like that one foundation. And it's not easy to get there. And your team, in terms of a culture, there will be times where it feels really psychologically safe, and then perhaps someone leaves, someone else joins, perhaps there's a big project. Psychological safety is almost like a mist that is quite hard to kind of capture and keep in a constant, but it's about always recognizing, how am I creating psychological safety? Am I making my people feel safe to contribute? Am I making my people feel that they are listened to, that they are heard? And what can I do to help build that in a hybrid environment as well? Because it's even tougher when you're in a hybrid world, right? You lack the ability to connect as human beings when you're working through a screen. It's much harder to spot body language, to see if people are perhaps responding in certain ways. And perhaps in a meeting room where everyone's in the room, you might have lack of psychological safety might look like people interrupting each other, people not feeling able to speak up. Whereas in a hybrid environment, it's a lot harder to spot that stuff. If someone's online and they have been trying to speak up but haven't been able to or feel nervous to, it's really easy to miss that as a leader. So that risk, feeling like people are being ignored, they're not knowing when to speak, or they're worried about how they'll come across on camera as well. So it's when we don't have psychological safety, that stuff really starts to have an impact when it comes to hybrid meetings, to hybrid working. And it's like the failures happen more quietly, which means that they're harder to spot and they're harder to deal with as well. So it's thinking about, what can you do in terms of a process, in terms of the ways in which you are setting up your meetings, the ways in which you are planning your meetings, following up from your meetings, to make sure that you are building that psychological safety behaviors into your day-to-day interactions. Because it's not going to be easy to just spot where something feels like there's lack of psychological safety. So it's about going, well, what are some of the baseline things that I want to do to make sure that I'm pushing for psychological safety in my meetings as much as possible? Silence, I mentioned this before. Never does silence mean nothing. It usually means so much. When people aren't talking, are they fed up? Are they cynical? Are they just processing at a different speed? Are they reflecting? Do they feel overloaded, confused? Do they feel so angry and they can't even bring themselves to say what they need to say? Do they have something they want to say but they're worried that they'll be judged for it? There are so many different things that silence could mean, and we often try to fill silence, or we try to kind of move through it and feel like, oh, more speaking up is good, and if people aren't speaking, they're either happy or they're frustrated, and that's them being a bit petty because they're not speaking up. And if they wanted to share, then they would share. But actually, there's so many different reasons why silence exists. And to be inclusive, it's about getting curious about what that silence is. Why is that silence there? What is it that's sitting underneath that silence, rather than just trying to fill the space? And there are lots of different things that might cause silence. Yes, people might be frustrated, they might be disengaged, they might not be listening. In a hybrid world, it's a lot easier for people to not be listening. They can be checking their emails, wandering off. It does create a real barrier in between that level of engagement. But there are other things that might be causing that silence as well. I've mentioned several times processing time, and I think that that's a really important thing to be aware of. We do not all think at the same speed. We need different periods of time to reflect. We might think out loud. We might need real time to let things settle. We might need a couple of days. There are lots of different ways in which people process information. And if we are not giving people the space to do that in their own way, then we're being really, really uninclusive. And I think for many, many years, since we started working in a 9-to-5 office, we reward and often move up into leadership positions people who are able to speak actively, who are able able to confidently respond in the moment, give their ideas, be very visible, come across in a really kind of confident, credible, professional way. Whereas there are so many people whose brains don't work like that. And that does not mean that they are not incredible at their job. It just means that they are perhaps not incredible at speaking up in meetings. And unless their job is purely to speak up in meetings, then we're really kind of missing a trick, and we're being foolish if we think that they are then less than, or that they can't perform because they're unable to do that. Power imbalance, that dynamic, often there is a concept called hippo, which is highest paid person's opinion. And this is that every meeting that isn't purely psychological, there's not enough psychological safety in a meeting, then no matter whether it feels like there's been a good debate, whether it feels like you've had a great conversation back and forth, no matter what happens in the meeting, whatever the conclusion will be, it'll be whatever the highest paid person in that room wants it to be. So even if you don't think you're doing that or influencing it, leadership, that dynamic means that is what happens. So you can do simple things to address that, which is like, as a leader, as the highest paid person in the room, you speak last, or you don't speak at all, and you say, I want to hear from everyone else, and then I'll reflect and I'll come back. There are different ways in which you can try and address that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But we often will find it comfortabler, we'll find it safer to either say nothing, to challenge in no way, or to just say, yes, I agree. And that might be because you feel scared. It might be because it feels safer. It might be because you don't have the energy and you think, you know what, fine, I agree. But that power imbalance means that a lot of the time your teams will be agreeing to stuff or not disputing stuff because it feels easier from a safety perspective, from an effort perspective. And that means that psychological safety is lacking, and you're likely then to be missing out on that performance, to be missing out on that innovation. And one of the things that I remember saying to a group of leaders recently, which got kind of a bit of a shocked response, but I think is important, is often a sense check in terms of psychological safety. Like, how psychologically safe is my team? And I said, if you think about over the past 3 months, how much constructive feedback have you received? So how much critique or feedback, that perhaps isn't stuff that you necessarily, it wasn't telling you were fabulous, it was giving you kind of critical feedback. How much of that have you received over the past 3 months? Because if it's not a lot or none, the chances are you have very low psychological safety, because we all as human beings, we all as humans, all as teams and performers, we will always have things that we can be building on and we can be growing. And if you don't have a culture where people feel able to say that to you as a leader, then your psychological safety is going to be really low. So it's a sense check in terms of that power. Is that power then impacting how people feedback, how people communicate? Sensory or cognitive overload. It's hard work being on a screen. It is hard work trying to listen to different people, trying to work out when you should speak. You don't have to be neurodivergent to feel that overload, but obviously for people who are neurodivergent, it's going to be more distinct as well. I myself am neurodivergent. I have ADHD, and I really can feel that overload often when I'm in certain situations, especially kind of group situations. And the energy it takes for me to just navigate those situations can be vast. And for someone else, it wouldn't be a problem at all. They might actually feel like their energy is being renewed by being in that situation. But for me, it's really, really draining me. And just being able to be aware of the fact that the same situation is different for different people, and it can be costing them different things. And in a team, if you have a team of 4, 5, 20, 100 people, you are going to have a real variety of different people in terms of how a hybrid meeting impacts them. Unclear expectations. If people feel like they don't know what's expected of them, am I meant to feedback on this? Do they want me to delve into the detail? What is it I'm supposed to do? And also that fear of getting it wrong. I don't want to put my head up off the pulpit and say something and then be judged or be embarrassed for getting it wrong. So there are so many different reasons why people might not speak up. It's about understanding those and creating environments, creating cultures and small ways of working that are going to help you overturn some of those risks, reduce some of those risks, and give people more opportunity to be able to communicate with you. something for you to reflect on for you personally. Either feel free to share it in the chat if you want to, or just reflect yourself. But think about when I'm in my meetings, either I'm running them or I'm attending them, who's speaking the least in those hybrid meetings? And what assumptions am I making about them? Are they negative assumptions? Am I assuming that they are not a team player? Am I assuming that they've not got anything good to say? Like, what are the biases that I then hold when I'm thinking about people who don't speak in hybrid meetings? Just being able to understand that often we kind of still, because we're so used to that way of working, that it's like you need to be able to speak up verbally in the moment to be someone who is a good performer. Whereas actually, I think that we're then rewarding a certain type of behavior that actually isn't needed in a lot of people's roles. So therefore, it feels like a silly thing to be demanding of everyone, when actually it's thinking about what can we do from a systemic perspective to make sure that we're making it easier for everyone to be able to contribute. And what are some of the things that we can do there around this? I'm going to take you through in terms of a bit of a process, in terms of some of the practical things that you can look at before the meeting. I talked about psychological safety and how important that is. When we feel safe, I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of neurobiology overview. When we feel safe, we've got our nervous system, right? We've got our amygdala in our brain, and our amygdala is always scanning the environment for threats. And when we feel unsafe, our amygdala says, I've seen a threat, and it puts our nervous system into fight or flight. And that is going to release adrenaline, cortisol in our body. Our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up. We've probably kind of shallow breathing because our body is ready for fight or flight. And now our amygdala in our brain, it hasn't really evolved since we were cavemen or cave women. So it's a very simple part of our brain. It sees a threat, it says threat to life, puts your nervous system into fight or flight. And now in the world we live in, we are triggered by things constantly, day to day. There are so many things that it might be a rude email, it might be a kind of sense of ambiguity, it might be someone shouting at you on the bus. There are so many different things that send your nervous system into fight or flight. And unfortunately, our amygdala doesn't really know the difference between a rude email and a life-threatening situation. So our body responds in that way, and our nervous system goes, that adrenaline is running around, and then we don't feel safe. And when we don't feel safe, we are focused on the top priority, which is survival. So things like collaboration, good decision making, thinking strategically, thinking about being polite to other people, collaborating, being innovative, all of that stuff is just completely deprioritized, because right now all you want to do is survive. So you are focusing, perhaps you might get quite defensive, you'll be quite tunnel visioned, you'll be spotting more negative stuff in your environment because you're just trying to think about how do you make sure that you're pulling as many threats out of your environment as possible. So therefore, when you're in survival mode, you are not your best self. You're not your best self to your friends and family. You are not your best self when you are performing at work. So it's about how can we make sure through psychological safety that we are making sure that people in our teams are not in survival mode, that they are able to move back down into rest and digest rather than fight or flight. Because fight or flight is a really important part of our biology, and it's important that we are able to do that to respond to threats. But a lot of the time we get stuck there, and it's meant to be an acute, short period of time where we move into fight or flight, deal with the threat, and then move back. But when we are being triggered all over the place, we often stay in fight or flight, and that really impacts our ability to do our work, perform sustainably, work in terms of high performance as a team. And when it comes to moving up to meetings, if I pull this back to the hybrid meeting approach, ambiguity is a massive trigger for us as human beings, because uncertainty is a threat to life. When's my next meal coming? Do I have shelter? What if I turn up to something and I'm embarrassed? Because embarrassment or other people judging you, we are tribal creatures, and the idea that we might be judged or shunned is really scary for us as human beings, because if we're shunned from a tribe, we're less likely to be able to survive. We are tribal, collaborative creatures. So ambiguity, that equals a lack of safety to us. So what can we do when it comes to hybrid meetings to make sure that we are reducing that ambiguity as much as possible? When we have unclear meetings, when people show up and they don't know why they're there, how they're expected to contribute, whether they're meant to critique an idea, whether they are meant to feedback, or whether they're meant to just listen. All of that ambiguity is going to make people feel less safe. And when you feel less safe, you feel more in survival mode, you're much more likely to not put yourself out there. You're not going to be vulnerable. So you're going to increase that silence. You are going to have less people speaking up, less people feeling confident to give their ideas and their feedback. So what can you do in the build up to these meetings to make sure that you're being really clear? This is what the meeting is for. This is why people are joining. This is what we expect of you. This is what you need to contribute. And these are some of the ways in which we're going to allow you to contribute. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So when we get to the actual meeting, we're actually in a hybrid meeting. And one of the things that I want to just reiterate is, if the only way to influence a meeting is to be able to speak quickly and confidently, then you are not measuring engagement. You are rewarding one type of communication style. So we need to move away from thinking that is the only way to be heard. It's about thinking about what can we do to make sure that we have the formats and the processes in place so that everyone can be heard, especially people who would never be able to speak up and feedback in that kind of way. So thinking about what are some of the ways that we can leverage tech. Tech is never going to create inclusion, but it is a good way of being able to leverage and help us build around in terms of what are some of the processes that mean that people are able to feedback in different ways. So in terms of some of the suggestions, really practical things that you can do within your meetings. Slow the pace right down. Don't be scared of silence. And I know that is like, silence is scary. And I know myself, when I'm facilitating online, it is really hard to sit sometimes when you're waiting for people to feedback. But often you can see a few people and they're sort of going towards their mouse. They might come off mute, they might not, they're not sure. And if you move on too quickly, you lose all of that great feedback, all of that great insights. It's about holding that silence, slowing down that pace a bit. And so one of the ways is thinking about, how do you let everyone to feedback on a kind of common ground? So before anyone speaks out loud, say, let's go into the chat first. Everyone pops their ideas in the chat, or we do a poll. Perhaps we do a Slido or a Mentimeter poll, so that we're getting everybody's, or a word cloud, so we're getting everybody's thoughts first. So you're asking for input before opening the discussion. You're giving everyone kind of a blank canvas, a common ground to be able to feedback. And then that helps you to be able to get all of the ideas, but it's pulling it out. It doesn't matter kind of people's level of confidence. It slows down those dominant voices, and it also allows a space for reflection, because you can say, we're going to take 5 minutes here to do this, take time to reflect, and it gives people who are remote just equal ability to feedback as well. So it's like, let's take this before we do any verbal feedback. Let's go into the chat, or let's go into a Slido and feedback in that way. Then what can we do to make sure that we are allowing remote people perhaps to speak first? And I know I've done that too, where I'm in a room and I'm delivering in a room, but there are people who are dialed in remotely. It's really easy to forget they're there, but it's actually being really conscious of saying, right, well, I want to hand to the people who are remote. What's the feedback? Asking them direct questions, giving people an opportunity to feedback remotely, often before people in the room, because already you're at a disadvantage when you're remote in a hybrid meeting. It's really hard to get that sense of when you can feedback, when you can't. So giving people who are remote more of an opportunity to speak first. And then also make that predictable as well. People get to know the flow. We're going to do remote first. We're then going to ask people to raise their hands, or even kind of having a talking stick or something. So it's much more process and clear who gets to speak when, and that you've got an opportunity to do it in written as well, or you've got an opportunity to feedback later as well. Some people need a day or so to reflect, so it's saying, this has been great, I love to capture all these ideas, I've got until the end of the week, so if you want to feedback to me via email, then feel free to do that. I will be checking, or I'll send a reminder on Friday just to make sure that I'm capturing everybody's ideas, so everyone knows they've got an opportunity to speak in several different formats, in several different ways. So then I've talked about taking turns. How do we make sure that we are giving people that opportunity to take turns? And how do we make sure that also some of those voices in the chat are being heard? So you might, as a leader, make sure that you're reading some of the comments in the chat out loud, or pinning some of those comments, or doing like a Slido Q&A. It could even be anonymous if it feels like a situation where people need that extra level of safety. So you're making sure that you're bringing that conversation into the main discussion as well. So it doesn't feel just like a side room or like it's deprioritized in terms of the content. So making sure that you don't have that two-tier system of influence where it's, yes, we're allowing you to put stuff in the chat, but still speaking out loud is going to have the most power. We're going to validate that more. It's making sure that you have that equality when it comes to the way in which people are feedbacking. And then, as I mentioned before, normalizing that silence, allowing pause and asynchronous input as well. You sometimes get some of the best feedback asynchronously. So it's having pauses in your meetings, allowing people to be able to speak and reflect, and then also giving people that time afterwards. Okay, we're going to have a couple of days. So if you want to feedback into this document, or you want to send an email, or you want to complete this Slido or this Survey Monkey, so many different options in terms of how you can use it. You don't need any new tech for any of this stuff. It's all about just using some of the stuff that you have to leverage and kind of build those moments. And then that helps you be able to have those intentional pauses. And it stops people feeling that pressure to perform or to come up with good ideas in the moment. And it supports different people's processing style. And then that stops reading that silence as disengagement as well, because you are intentionally giving that time for silence where people are reflecting and perhaps feeding back through the written word. And then also, what do you do as a leader to make sure that you are naming the dynamics that are coming up as well? Perhaps you're saying, I'm noticing that this is a topic where people seem less keen to speak up. Is there a reason for that? Or I'm noticing that actually we're hearing a lot more from people in the room, and I'd love to kind of be able to lean in a bit more to the people who are remote. It's about recognizing some of those dynamics and being able to name them as a leader. It's not about criticizing the process. It's about saying, actually, I think that there's certain things that are showing up here. And what are these patterns? What are the patterns that are showing up? Because when we lead as a leader and name some of this stuff, it helps other people relax and follow, and perhaps have an opportunity to say, well, actually, I've noticed that too. And here are some of the things that we might be able to do to address that. Once you've had the meetings, what do you do next? What happens next? Because often we lose psychological safety when we don't follow up, when we are not consistent with the things that we say. So what can you do to make sure that the follow-up is just as powerful, just as important as the things that the conversations that you're having in the meeting? If you have been leaning into the chat function or or you're using Slido, how do you make sure that you are following up with that? You're making sure that you're giving people an opportunity to feedback asynchronously, and then summarizing. This is what I've heard as a leader. This is what's happening next. This is what we're actioning next. This is what isn't moving forward and why. Often I think we want to say, oh, well, we can't do that, so let's not mention it again. But then everyone's going, oh, we talked about this thing happening and it never happened. And I'm frustrated by that. And no one ever even told us why. It's face those things head on. We heard this, and that's, we appreciate the feedback on that, but these are the reasons why we can't move forward with that. People much prefer that transparency than trying to feel like those ideas and thoughts are ignored. So what is it that you can do to make sure that you're closing that loop? And those follow-ups are so important, especially for people who are remote, who are more likely to be the quieter voices, because it feels then like they are being taken seriously. That stuff is being thought of, reflected, and being fed back as well. And also, you want to make sure that you are pulling in what has happened in the chat. What is the asynchronous feedback that you've got, to make sure that people realize that that isn't second best, that is being seen as just as valuable as the voices in the room, because that is where some of the best ideas come from. I know that often I might say something in a meeting and then later I'll think, oh, I've got much better ideas now. I've had a chance to think about it. So what can you do to make sure that you're closing that loop, that you are showing people that their input matters, and making sure that you're having that continuous communication going forward? And also, how do you respect the conversations that are happening in those meetings? How do you make sure that you're not then taking them somewhere else, perhaps talking to other people in a leadership position and just making decisions elsewhere? Because when you take those decisions and make them elsewhere, whether they're happening on Slack or by the water cooler or over a glass of wine when you're out to dinner, people then feel lack of safety when it comes to meetings. They feel like they're not being heard. They feel like those meetings, what's the point of turning up? What's the point of sharing my ideas? What's the point of my input if actually you're going to take those decisions and make them elsewhere? So not that kind of ivory tower thinking. It's about going, we are doing this collaboratively as a team. I want your input, and then I want to be able to feedback what we can do and what we can't do going forward. And then how do we make sure that we have some norms as well? Going back to that point about ambiguity in our nervous system, we like to know what's expected of us. We like to know what's good, what's not, what else we can be doing, what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. Do I do am I gonna be judged if I type instead of speak? Am I allowed to disagree? Am I gonna, if I put stuff in the chat, will it be seen or is it gonna be completely ignored? So it's about understanding what are some of the digital norms that you wanna pull through. What are some of the things that you wanna have as expectations? It's not about having rules, but it's saying in these meetings, these are some of the expectations so that people know where they stand. So might be saying where decisions are gonna happen, what has to happen right now, what are some things that can happen asynchronously, why, what is it that we need to have in the chat, what are some things that we need fed back in certain ways so people understand that expectation. Are we allowed to disagree in the chat? Are we allowed to ask questions publicly, or are we allowed to ask them anonymously? What's the tone? So you help to have those norms and understandings of what it is that people are allowed to or expected to do versus what they're not. How quickly do you need to respond? Are you allowed to reflect for 2 days, or does it need to be a couple of hours? What about across time zones? Is it okay to genuinely not respond if you feel that it's something that you don't have much input in or don't really have many thoughts on? What's okay and what's not? And then what can we do to make sure that we are inputting, how does that quieter input, how do we make sure that we are surfacing that? Do we allocate someone who reads out the chat? Do we allocate someone who makes sure that they are responsible for being the voice of people who are quieter? Perhaps you have breakout rooms and then people are feeding back. There are lots of different ways to make sure that those voices are being heard. So just a little bit, I'm wrapping up now, so I've got a bit of time for questions. If anyone has any questions, do feel free to pop those in the chat. But we often then go, okay, that's great. How am I going to measure some of this stuff? How do I prove that this is working, or how do I know that this is working? Inclusion, it's going to be felt before it's measured, and often we try to measure stuff and then we make it worse. Like if we're trying to put real data points onto inclusion, especially when it comes to things like hybrid meetings, we'll often make it feel less safe if we're measuring things like who's speaking, who's attending, what are the responses we're getting, because then we're measuring outputs, whereas really inclusion is about how do people feel. So what is it that we want to be asking people? What is it that we want to be understanding? So it might be like doing quick pulse surveys over a period of time. I felt able to contribute in a way that worked for me. My input influenced the outcome. I felt heard, and it's actually what I said made a difference. I felt comfortable speaking up in this meeting. These are questions that people are able to reflect on and really help you to be able to measure inclusion versus it being outputs like who spoke, who was involved, what is it, what did people contribute remotely or in the room. It's about actually how do people feel. And thinking about trends, we are never going to get this perfect. We're never going to get it right straight away, but it's like, are we moving in the right direction? Are we taking one step in the right direction? And how does this look over time? Because there will be times where things go up and down. Psychological safety, as I said, it's a moving feast a lot of the time. So it's making sure that we really reflect on where it is we want to go and are we moving towards that rather than all of the kind of individual dips, peaks and troughs. And just a little reminder in terms of silence. Silence is rarely the absence of idea. It usually means that there's risk. People are feeling nervous. People are feeling unsafe. So what can you do to make sure that you are designing a system where silence is okay and that there is space for silence, but also that there are ways in which you are doing things, processes, technology inputs that you are doing that means that you are gathering everybody's information. So when we think about those risk factors I talked about before, the things that can drive silence, processing speed, people feeling scared they're going to get it wrong, that stuff, the risk of those are minimized because people are able to feedback in a way that feels safe for them. We do not want to be designing meetings for one type of person. It is very uninclusive. It really does drive lack of engagement, and you are missing out on so much incredible skill, ideas, innovation when you don't open it up in a way that means that all types of brains, all types of backgrounds, all types of experiences are able to contribute. Just thinking about how do you design your meetings? How do you design the way in which you're communicating that means that you're able to capture and gather all of that stuff? And it's small steps, right? When you what are you going to take away from this? You might want to have a full plan in terms of how you're addressing your meetings, or it might be saying, I'm just going to do one thing differently, which is that I'm going to allow people to feedback in the chat. I'm going to make sure that we are being really conscious about what's coming through in the chat. Or it might be, I'm going to send a follow-up survey afterwards where people are able to feedback asynchronously. It might be just one small thing that you're going to do, because it's about making that progress, those small steps going forward. Because when we make those deliberate shifts, we're going to start to increase that psychological safety. We're going to start to increase the way in which we're driving inclusion and leveraging all of the types of thought that we have in our teams. And that's going to make hybrid meetings feel a lot more useful, a lot more engaging, and a lot more valuable for you as a leader and for your teams as well. So that brings me to the end. I will open up if there's anyone in the chat that would like to ask questions, then feel free to do so. And other than that, I hope that that was helpful. I hope that there are, some reflections or things that you can apply. It's all about being able to do just one thing differently, and start to see that shift, rather than overwhelming yourself with a whole plan.
Claire, on behalf of everybody that's watching or that sees the recording afterwards, let me say thank you. You've packed so much into that, but it's very kind of you as well to allow us to share the recording for a short while afterwards, because I think it will be really useful for people to be able to go through each of them. You raised so many points, so much information there. It was great. Before we get to the questions that people have asked, one of the things that stood out for me, quite early on, you mentioned about we treat silence as a personality issue and it's a system issue.
Mhm.
And this isn't exactly on track for what you were talking about, but the first thing that came to mind for me was when Zoom announced the feature of being able to put your hand up.
Mm.
And it just surprised me that they've made that into a feature, because most of us recognize that action from being at school. And it's hardly one that is a comfortable memory for most of us, either being forced to be the one to raise your hand. So
Yeah.
the only time you do it willingly at school is when you need the bathroom, not because you want to speak up.
It does all, yeah, and you're right, actually, because it also does kind of raise the idea of a power balance as well, doesn't it? It's like a teacher and you raising your hand to like ask permission to be able to do something versus there being a kind of a gathering of equals, which I hadn't really thought of, but yeah, there's definitely some sort of connections that it can raise.
Yes, it occurred to me at the time that I wouldn't be putting my hand up in the meetings.
No, yeah.
We're not going to do it now. One question that a couple of people have asked in various different ways. You mentioned that it was really easy to miss someone being unable to speak up.
Mhm.
Is there a way, when you're running or hosting a meeting, to be able to, are there ways to be able to tell the differences between someone who is being disengaged, or concentrating really, I guess, on the meeting, rather than being in a mode where they have something that they would rather say, and someone being silenced by the system or by the nature of the meeting that they're in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tricky to kind of diagnose what's going on for different people, which is why I think it's usually better to focus on how do you create a system where you kind of capture all of that. You might, especially if you know your team well, or you're working with your team over time, then it's easier to be able to spot patterns within your team, and often not comparing your team to each other, but comparing them to themselves. They're different. They seem less engaged than last week, versus, oh well, they're not as engaged as Dave, and he's always chatting away. It's like, actually, well, that's not a helpful comparison versus the themes of how they are. And then there's always opportunities to be able to kind of follow up directly with people. But I think with anything, I think there's risk that comes with making assumptions about what you know about someone else versus giving them the opportunity in a safe way to tell you the facts of how it is they feel. And the more that you're able to do that and be a leader that people feel safe to do that, then you're going to get things where you're not making an assumption or guesswork to diagnose an issue.
Or making assumptions even on your own experience of the meeting. We have, well, as you know, in our team, we have an international team. We have agents based around the world, and a good part of our marketing team that I liaise with on a regular basis are based out of the Philippines.
Okay.
Often when we have our meeting, it's easy for me to forget that it's the start of my day, but the end.
Yeah.
They feel anything like I do towards the end of the working day.
Yeah.
Our energy levels are completely different. It is that awareness, isn't it, of being of paying as close attention as you possibly can to what you see in the meeting in terms of people's energy levels and their level of engagement.
Yeah. And for some people, and I know for me, I can't do. I'm not like I don't like chit chat and like small talk. I like that really, really drains my energy. And the more I kind of understand about my neurodiversity, like my neurodivergence is so really kind of connected to that. But for someone else, they might enjoy that. That might really kind of boost their energy. And but that's just who I am, and that's part of who I am. And it's almost like I finding a meeting harder, or finding it less engaging is more about, as a leader, not being like, well, then this is a failure, or you're a failure, or you're not a team player. It's going, well, then what do we do to create systems that are not leaving you behind, or are not excluding you, and I'm still getting the opportunity to hear from you, versus it being like we've all got to behave in a certain way, and we've all got to kind of fake it and pretend, and that only works for so long, right? Until people just kind of burn out if they're kind of pretending something all the time.
I guess then part of that then is making sure that that everybody understands as well that people respond to these things differently. You don't like small chat, neither do I. Small talk, sorry, in a meeting. So if there's, even if the meeting's made clear and they're doing their best to remove ambiguity, and they're saying, look, in the beginning it'll just be a round robin hello, and everybody gets to say they are. If we're aware of that, we should be. Is it that we need to be given permission to stay out of that if it evolves into
Well, I mean, I think we all have to do things we don't love, right? Like I think that there's a level of creating a playing field, where we want to make sure that we're leaning into certain things. But I think there's also we're perhaps going to do a bit of a chit chat at the beginning, but it's contained, and it's but there are some people. But I also think, sometimes when you're doing a round, let's all introduce ourselves, and you can see certain people are absolutely terrified, and it's really, really hard for them. And I try and think about the balance. Like, is the cost to this person really worth it? Like, it doesn't feel like a kindness sometimes. We have to think, is is this, am I just throwing this out there because it's easy for me and it seems easy, but actually what is the cost to perhaps some of my neurodivergent team members or people who are painfully kind of introverted, or it's a second language, or there's so many different things that might make something a lot harder for them. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do certain things, but it's about being a bit more conscious about whether you're doing it because it's easy for you. Have you considered the challenges for other people, and is it worth that cost versus not worth that cost?
It's potentially very counterproductive as well,
Yeah.
because the whole idea of everybody introducing themselves is that you get to learn something about everyone in the room. And some of those people that are in that situation, as soon as you announce that's what you're going to be doing, their thoughts are entirely on what are they going to say.
Oh yeah, no, they don't hear anybody else, right?
Yeah,
It's not.
exactly.
It's
Yeah,
not an icebreaker. It's a real like, oh God. So,
absolutely.
yeah. So I think it's about perhaps not just falling onto old traditional stuff
Sure.
because that's what you've always done, and going, oh, is there a different way in which we could do this? And even if it's breaking down into smaller groups, sometimes I think people feel a lot more comfortable chatting in a smaller group, and then perhaps the most confident person in that group then feeds back and says, so
Yes.
the messages get fed back, but people don't feel like they have to do it themselves.
I like
So
that. I think I can
yeah.
remember many, many years ago a real world version of that from a networking event or meeting that I remember attending many years ago. They break it into those little groups and then having one person be the spokesperson and introducing the
Yeah.
system. But it was a
Yeah,
lot of fun.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right. I should ask some of these questions. I'm dominating your time, Claire, but I found your talk so fascinating. So you talked about not designing meetings for one type of person or brain, which led to a question. If you are leading a large team where there's very many different personalities and needs, is there one single mindset shift that makes the biggest difference in giving everyone a voice?
Sorry, say that again. So, as in, what's the
So if
like?
you're
What's the
leading
one thing you
a large,
do?
yeah, is there one particular mindset shift that would make the biggest difference in giving everybody a voice in a particularly large team? I guess you
Yeah,
mean a particularly large meeting.
yeah. I think it's giving people a safe way to feedback. So it's allowing people to feel safe to use the chat or a Slido, word cloud or something that people are allowed to use, and not feel like that's a cop out to do that,
Yes.
because that will cover a lot of different types of of of
Yeah.
silence causes, right? If people need time to process, or they're a bit more nervous, that helps kind of capture that. So I think it's two, which is a bit of a cheat, but it's like, make sure that you allow people to be able to type their thoughts, and also allow people to feedback a day later. So you're allowing an async feedback as well, and then that will help you capture the wide majority, I think, of different processing and kind of brain types.
It is one of the things that stood out for me that became very clear, because of the volume of ideas and suggestions that you have is almost encyclopedic, the range of really useful information. I know that you do a lot of work with organizations in this, both in your keynotes and in workshops. So again, thank you for providing that depth of information. But the thing that stood out for me was what you talked about: small steps, what I would call small intentional choices that you make. So another question I think came in shortly after that is, where do we start? I'm paraphrasing the question.
Yeah.
I think in essence, the question is, where do we start? What's the best place to begin?
Yeah. I think it's having a little reflection. So have a think about your meetings. So if you are leading meetings and you're leading your team for the next couple of meetings, don't do anything different. Just observe them with this knowledge, and think. There was a couple of questions I asked about thinking about what are some of the things that might be showing up. Are there certain things that you think, are coming time and time again? Who was not speaking? Why might that be? And just give yourself a bit of a a review, and then I think it's about going, well, then what is it that I want to do to address? What actually am I trying to get out of these meetings? And I think often we need to critically analyze our meetings, because a lot of the time we're having meetings that we shouldn't even be having. So it's going, actually, how do I make these meetings a lot more powerful? And in a hybrid world, I'm sure one of the best ways to drive performance is to give people less meetings. So it's saying, actually, which of these meetings can we get rid of, and what can we do to put much more effort into the way we design other meetings, so that we are getting much more power on us, bringing us together, and what are other things that we could actually be doing asynchronously, because it will help us from a time perspective, from an efficiency perspective, and most people will prefer to feedback in that way. And then the meetings we are keeping, what is it that I've observed, and what are some of the things that I want to do differently to address that? And what am I doing? What are some of them? You only have to do one or two things to start with, because it's all about those small steps.
I would love to do one of these talks without ever bringing up the subject of AI. But I don't think, I think we live in an age now where this isn't going to be possible. So this is the AI moment of the talk. The AI question. You mentioned about, I think you said about giving a summary of the meeting after sending an email around. There are so many AI tools out there that do these summaries for you, and will even email them to all the attendees. And I think the companies that create these tools are great companies, but I think it's been proven over and over again now in many organizations, nobody reads these. When
No.
you let AI do the summary and that's all that you send out, nobody ever reads them. Now, do you have any comments or feedback on that?
Well, when I was talking about kind of following up, what people need to feel is that they've been heard. So having an AI summary tool does not make you feel heard, because there's no proof that you have been heard. So I think whilst AI can be very helpful, I think as a leader, you would probably want to, if you're leveraging AI, you'd want to use the summary to then pull out what were the things that really mattered, and then what are we going to do about it, versus what are the next steps, and write something that feels very like simple bullets. This is what came out of this meeting, and this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're not doing, and why, and these are the next steps. And if people want to read the full AI summary, they can, but it's about people feeling heard, so that it needs to be a human touch there. It doesn't mean that the AI can't help you, remind you of what the key themes are, but just sending an AI summary is not making people feel heard, because that's not what it's there to prove.
Absolutely. I think we're getting up to the hour. I think we've gone over the hour now. So once again, I'm going to say thank you for all the energy and all the information that you've provided us with. I know we talked very briefly earlier about our plans beyond these pilot sessions in the spring. And I hope that you'll be able to join us again for further sessions then. And for the people watching, we'll be providing more information about what we're going to be doing very shortly. So thank you to Claire. Thank you to everyone who joined us.
No, thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. You've provided so much information. It's been great. The recording will be available via the event page almost immediately afterwards, and we will be emailing the tidied up recording, I think the polished one, within the next 24 to 48 hours. So once again, Claire, thank you. Have a great
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.